And I ended up moving out here, partially because I knew that the Green Line was going to open.
Well, there is a lot of development happening now. We're so excited that there's more housing.
I've known business owners that had to shut down because they couldn't afford the rent that landlords see coming.
Actually, I know a lot of people who it's like gone up like almost $1,000, like hundreds of dollars.
Some places are going to benefit, but other places are going out of business.
For decades, Somerville residents and activists have advocated for the Somerville Green Line extension, a project that would bring 2 new branches of the T to the city. Originally intended to make Somerville more accessible, particularly for lower-income residents, the extension has seemingly contributed to rising rents that are driving out the very same residents it was intended to serve. Somerville housing advocates are building a statewide movement to bring back rent control and increase tenant protections.
This is Union Square.
The Union Square station, which opened in March, is the first new stop on the extension. Ben Ewan-Campen, Somerville City Councilor representing Union Square, said he and others want one thing: development without displacement.
Every time public transportation is expanded, that is a good thing. At the same time, because we don't have rent stabilization, because we don't have strong enough tenant protections, the people who need public transit most of all can't afford to live anywhere near it. Both those things are true at the same time.
It is far past time for Somerville to have mass transit like the Green Line, and we really honor and celebrate the generations of resident leaders and activists who made this possible. Most importantly, though, we don't want to abandon the reality that many residents are being pushed out from Somerville and losing their homes because of this same public good. But that's the thing, it should be a public good and not just a commodity and not just a right for the wealthy and well-connected.
With the Green Line extension in the works, rent has been rising for years in Somerville. Since 2011, the average rent has risen nearly 29% over inflation. A 2014 report by the Massachusetts Area Planning Council predicted that rents near the Green Line extension stations could increase by 25 to even 70%. As around 2/3 of Somerville residents are renters, these projected rent increases could displace thousands of residents.
What we have seen really recently, as the Green Line has gotten realer and realer and now is really real, is a just dramatic increase in the scale of the rent increases, in the scale of home price increases, and in the amount of displacement that we're seeing. It's just absolutely skyrocketed in the last couple of years.
There's a whole tool belt of housing strategies and small business support that must be pursued at the same time and with the same goals of the transit expansion or improvement, so that the transit is actually benefiting the people who live and work on the corridor and not future people who aren't there.
This is not about saying we don't want development in Somerville. This is about saying we want the development that comes to Somerville to benefit the people who are facing displacement right now. So that means pushing as hard as we can for community benefits agreements.
Community benefits agreements have emerged as a way to work with the developers coming into these newly accessible neighborhoods with the intention to build. The agreements give neighborhood activists a chance to negotiate standards or conditions for new construction in exchange for local support of new developments.
The community benefits agreement, that is an agreement that was negotiated between a community group, the Union Square Neighborhood Council, and the developer. This was a grassroots movement for many years, putting pressure on the developer to sit down with the community and negotiate a community benefits agreement. Since then, 2 other developers who have come to Somerville, they kind of read the writing on the wall that a community benefits agreement is the expectation now.
In those documents, you see things like, let's make sure all the greenery in the new development is native and like supports local pollinators. Things like a community center, right? We're also seeing other standards again in terms of like the diversity of the employees that they're hiring to do said work, as well as making sure they offer job fairs to local residents.
Though community benefits agreements have successfully secured affordable housing and other benefits for Somerville residents, they have not completely mitigated the risks of gentrification and displacement.
So without rent stabilization, there really is ultimately no way to prevent the kinds of rent increases that we are seeing in Somerville.
You know, people and advocates on all sides of the spectrum, I think, view rent control as a dirty word and insist that it might prevent the market from building, allowing for more housing. But in the meantime, we have a crisis at hand.
The big solution that would really make a fundamental change here would be rent control. Because cities and towns like Somerville are not allowed to step in and keep rents reasonable, we're left in a situation where there is nothing stopping developers from buying up an apartment building full of long-term tenants, raising the rent to exorbitant prices, kicking them out, and flipping them.
Countless numbers of residents and families are being displaced from the city onto the next city, right? Until it starts happening to those communities as well. And so there needs to be something to stabilize these unaffordable rent increases and property tax increases.
Though housing advocates see rent control as an effective tool for combating the housing crisis, rent control was outlawed by a statewide referendum in 1994. Prior to the referendum, rent control had been utilized in Boston and Cambridge since the 1970s.
Rent control was extremely popular locally. They never succeeded in electing city councils that would, get rid of rent control because they were really needed. And in my opinion, rent control was an absolutely critical program.
Nonetheless, Somerville housing advocates hope that rent stabilization could eventually return as a tool to protect renters statewide.
The big vision that tenants and activists are pushing for is undoing the state prohibition on rent control. There is a bill at the State House right now, it's called the Tenant Protection Act, that would allow cities and towns to create rent stabilization at the local level. It's really about building a statewide movement that can have majority support on Beacon Hill.
The housing crisis, it exists in different forms, but it exists throughout the state. So basically, we're just having more and more and more cities and towns and more tenants saying we need housing, and more cities and towns saying we can't do this without new resources.
Transit is a public good. Again, it's for people. The only reason we have transit is because we have people.
This is about building political power for working class people, for tenants, in order to get this over the finish line.
I think that despite the fact that these statewide coalitions are a lot of work, they take a long time, and you don't always succeed, right? It has to be done, there's no choice.
The fact of the matter is, people are being harmed right now. There are families right now who are making trade-offs between whether they put food on the table for their kids or if they pay rent and utilities at the end of the month because they can't afford it.
Last stop. Thank you for taking the T. Don't forget your belongings.